A disabled veteran sat alone at the edge of the desert, his weathered hands gripping his wheelchair as the setting sun painted the Arizona sky in brilliant shades of amber. Without warning, a magnificent wild Mustang emerged from the dusty horizon, its muscular frame casting a long shadow across the sun-baked earth. As the untamed stallion drew near, something extraordinary transpired. A connection that defied all logic formed between the battle-scarred soldier and the wild creature. What could possibly draw a free spirit of the desert to a man whose own freedom had been forever altered by war? This chance encounter would set in motion a series of events that would leave an entire community in awe. James "Hawk" Harrison never imagined he'd find solace in the rugged outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona. The former Marine Scout sniper had chosen this secluded spot, a modest ranch house overlooking the vast Sonoran desert, as his refuge after returning from his final deployment. The property, inherited from his late uncle, sat on the border between civilization and wilderness, much like Hawk himself, caught between the structured world of his military past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Before the explosion that claimed both his legs, Hawk had been known for his incredible marksmanship and unwavering composure under pressure. His fellow Marines had given him the nickname Hawk for his keen eyesight and patient nature, waiting hours in position for the perfect shot. Now, 3 years after the IED incident in Afghanistan, those same qualities manifested differently. Instead of tracking targets through a scope, he found himself watching the desert wildlife from his porch, observing the delicate dance of survival that played out daily across the sun-baked landscape. The locals knew little about the solitary veteran who lived on the edge of town. Some had tried to welcome him when he first arrived, bringing casseroles and well-meaning questions about his service, but Hawk's responses had been polite, yet distant. His sister Mia made the drive from Phoenix twice a month, bringing supplies and updates about the outside world, but even she struggled to breach the emotional walls he'd built around himself. On this particular evening, Hawk had wheeled himself further from the house than usual. The physical therapist at the VA hospital had been pushing him to extend his range of movement, to challenge himself beyond his comfort zone. The desert stretched endlessly before him, a sea of rust-colored earth dotted with saguaro cacti and desert brush. The familiar weight of his service dog's tags hung around his neck, a reminder of Rex, the Belgian Malinois who had been his constant companion until cancer took him 6 months ago. The setting sun cast long shadows across the desert floor, and Hawk found himself remembering similar scenes from his deployments, the way the Afghan mountains would glow purple and orange as darkness approached. His thoughts were interrupted by an unusual movement in his peripheral vision. Years of military training had honed his situational awareness, and something large was approaching from the west. At first, Hawk thought it might be one of the local ranchers' horses that had broken free from their property. But as the figure drew closer, he recognized the unmistakable bearing of a wild Mustang. The horse's coat was the color of burnished copper, with a black mane that whipped in the evening, breezed like a battle standard. Its muscles rippled with each step, a testament to the harsh life of survival in the desert wilderness. Hawk remained perfectly still, his sniper's training taking over as he controlled his breathing and maintained his position. Wild horses rarely approached humans, and in all his time at the ranch, he'd only seen them as distant figures on the horizon. Yet this stallion was different. It moved with purpose, each step bringing it closer to where Hawk sat in his wheelchair. The horse's eyes, dark and intelligent, seemed to look straight through him. Hawk felt exposed, not as a threat or a potential victim, but as an equal, another soul who understood what it meant to carry scars, both visible and hidden. The Mustang's own body bore marks of its wild existence, a thin scar along its flank, a nick in one ear, testament to battles fought and survived. As the distance between them shortened to mere yards, Hawk became acutely aware of how vulnerable he was. His wheelchair, usually a source of mobility and independence, now seemed to root him to the spot. The Mustang's head lowered slightly, nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. Hawk's heart pounded against his ribcage, not from fear, but from a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. The moment stretched between them, measured in heartbeats rather than seconds. The horse's ears swiveled forward, focusing entirely on Hawk. In that instant, he felt something he hadn't experienced since his last days in the field. A profound sense of being precisely where he needed to be, connected to something larger than himself. Without warning, a distant coyote's howl shattered the silence. The Mustang's head snapped up, its powerful body tensing for flight, but instead of bolting immediately, it held Hawk's gaze for one more moment, as if committing him to memory. Then, with a grace that belied its size, the horse wheeled around and disappeared into the gathering dusk, leaving Hawk alone with the desert wind and his racing thoughts. As darkness settled over the landscape, Hawk remained in place, replaying the encounter in his mind. For the first time since losing Rex, he felt the stirring of something he'd thought long buried, a desire to connect, to reach beyond the carefully constructed walls of his solitude. The wild Mustang's visit had awakened something in him, a reminder that even in the vast emptiness of the desert, unexpected connections could bloom. When Mia arrived the next morning for her regular visit, she found her brother in an unusual state of animation. His typically guarded expression had softened, and his eyes held a spark she hadn't seen since before his injury. As he described the encounter with the wild Mustang, she noticed his hands gesturing with enthusiasm, his voice carrying an energy that had been absent for so long. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Hawk finished relating his story, casting sharp shadows across the desert floor. Mia watched her brother carefully, hope and concern warring in her heart. She had witnessed his slow withdrawal from the world after his injury, the way he had retreated into himself following Rex's death. Now, as he spoke about the Mustang's visit, she saw glimpses of the brother she remembered from before, the man who had once approached life with passion and purpose. What neither of them could know was that this unexpected encounter would mark the beginning of a journey that would not only change Hawk's life, but would ripple through their entire community, challenging preconceptions about healing, freedom, and the extraordinary bonds that can form between the most unlikely of souls. Life hadn't always been about solitude and desert sunsets for James Hawk Harrison. Before the explosion that shattered his world, he had been among the Marine Corps' most decorated scout snipers, with a service record that spoke of extraordinary skill and unwavering dedication. His journey had begun in the lush forests of North Carolina, where he'd grown up tracking deer with his father, learning the patient art of stillness that would later serve him so well in combat. The military had recognized his exceptional marksmanship early in his career. During his first deployment to Iraq, Hawk had distinguished himself by protecting his unit from an ambush, remaining motionless for 14 hours in a cramped position until the threat had been neutralized. It was this incident that earned him his call sign, Hawk, not just for his keen eye, but for his ability to remain perfectly still while maintaining unwavering focus on his objective. Through 3 deployments, Hawk had built a reputation as someone who could be counted on in the most challenging situations. His fellow Marines spoke of his almost supernatural ability to read terrain and predict enemy movement. He had saved countless lives through his skill and judgment, earning commendations that he kept tucked away in a box beneath his bed, remnants of a life that sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else. The incident that changed everything occurred during his 4th deployment, deep in the mountains of Afghanistan. Hawk had been leading a small team on a reconnaissance mission when they received intelligence about a high-value target in the area. The operation had been meticulously planned, every detail scrutinized, but no amount of preparation could have accounted for the buried IED that detonated beneath their vehicle. The explosion had claimed both his legs below the knee and left him with severe spinal injuries. The physical pain, though intense, paled in comparison to the psychological trauma of the aftermath. In those first few months at Walter Reed Medical Center, Hawk had struggled not just with his injuries, but with the loss of his identity. The man who had once moved like a shadow through hostile territory was now dependent on others for the most basic needs. It was during his rehabilitation that Rex had entered his life. The Belgian Malinois had been trained as a service dog, but there was something special about him that went beyond his training. Rex seemed to understand the darkness that sometimes threatened to overwhelm Hawk, pressing close during the worst moments, offering silent companionship during sleepless nights. Together, they had faced the challenges of learning to navigate the world in new ways. The decision to move to Arizona had come after Uncle Jack's passing. The old ranch house, with its wheelchair-accessible modifications and sprawling desert views, offered an escape from the well-meaning but suffocating concern of friends and fellow veterans. Mia had opposed the move at first, arguing that isolation wasn't the answer, but Hawk had been adamant. He needed space to figure out who he was now that everything had changed. Rex had made the transition easier, adapting to desert life with the same resilience he showed in everything else. They had developed a routine, early morning exercises recommended by the VA physical therapist, followed by hours spent on the porch, observing the desert wildlife. Rex would alert Hawk to approaching visitors long before they reached the property, giving him time to prepare himself for interaction or choose not to engage. The dog's death had been unexpected and swift. Cancer had taken him within weeks of diagnosis, leaving Hawk alone with his thoughts and the endless desert horizon. The tags he now wore around his neck were a constant reminder of the companion who had helped him find his way back to some semblance of life after the explosion. Myers. Attempts to convince him to get another service dog had been met with quiet resistance. "Some bonds can't be replaced," he had told her during one of their increasingly tense conversations. The truth was, Hawk wasn't sure he had the strength to open himself up to that kind of loss again. The military had taught him that attachment was a liability, and his experiences seemed to confirm this harsh lesson. His skills hadn't disappeared with his injuries. They had simply found new expression. The patience that had made him an exceptional sniper now helped him observe the desert's subtle changes. He noticed things others might miss. The way certain birds behaved before a storm, the patterns of coyote movement through his property, the seasonal shifts in the wind's direction. The desert became his new mission field. Though he never spoke of it that way to others, the local VA support group had tried to draw him into their community. They organized weekly meetings at a coffee shop in town, offering a space for veterans to share their experiences and challenges. Hawk had attended exactly once, sitting silently through stories of struggle and resilience. The other veterans had recognized something in him, the weight of experiences too heavy to voice, and respectfully kept their distance while making it clear the door remained open. Dr. Martinez, his VA psychiatrist, had been gently persistent in suggesting that isolation might be hindering his recovery. "Healing happens in community," she would say during their monthly video sessions, but Hawk remained unconvinced. The desert offered its own kind of therapy, one without words or expectations, without the need to explain or justify his choices. Property itself bore witness to his ongoing battle with physical limitations. Carefully installed handrails, modified doorways, and a series of ramps allowed him to maintain his independence. But each adaptation was a reminder of what had been lost. The gun cleaning kit that had once been a daily companion now sat untouched. On a high shelf, another artifact of his former life. Maya had tried to introduce potential caregivers, concerned about his insistence on living alone, so far from immediate help. Each attempt had been met with the same quiet but firm refusal. The military had trained him to be self-sufficient, and his injury hadn't changed that fundamental aspect of his character. He had developed his own systems, found ways to manage the daily challenges that came with his disability. The walls of his home told their own story, bare except for a single photograph of his unit and a folded American flag. In a triangular display case, the minimalism wasn't about aesthetics, but rather a reflection of his need for order and control in an existence that had been defined by chaos and loss. Each item had its place. Each routine was carefully maintained, creating a framework of predictability in a world that had proved devastatingly unpredictable. Yet beneath the carefully constructed facade of self-sufficiency, questions lingered that Hawk couldn't quite silence. Was this all there was? Had he survived the explosion only to exist in this liminal space between his past and an uncertain future? The appearance of the wild Mustang had stirred something in him, a recognition, perhaps, of another being who carried the marks of survival, who moved through the world on its own terms despite the scars it bore. The rhythm of Hawk's days had settled into a predictable pattern since moving to the desert outskirts. Each morning began before dawn, his military discipline undiminished by civilian life. He would wheel himself onto the porch, a steaming cup of black coffee in the custom holder Mia had attached to his chair, and watch the sun paint the sky in layers of purple and gold. The desert awakening had become his morning briefing. The movement of quail through the scrub brush, the lazy circles of hawks riding thermal currents, the skittering of lizards across sun-warmed rocks. Today felt different. As he positioned himself in his usual spot, his eyes constantly drifted to where the Mustang had appeared the previous evening. The rational part of his mind, the part honed by years of military training, told him the encounter was a one-time event. Wild horses were notoriously wary of humans, and this one had likely wandered too close by accident. Yet something deeper, perhaps the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless missions, suggested otherwise. Mia's weekly supply run brought more than just groceries and medical necessities. His sister had always served as his connection to the world beyond the desert, bringing news of family, updates from old military contacts, and the persistent worry that colored her voice whenever she spoke of his chosen isolation. Today, she arrived earlier than usual, her silver SUV kicking up dust as it wound its way along the unpaved driveway. "You look different," she said by way of greeting, studying his face with the scrutiny that had once made her an excellent emergency room nurse. "Something's changed since yesterday." Mia had always been able to read him, even when he'd returned from deployments wearing the blank expression that kept others at a distance. Now, as she unloaded bags of groceries and fresh medical supplies, her gaze kept returning to him, noting subtle shifts in his demeanor that others might miss. Hawk found himself sharing details of his evening encounter, describing the Mustang's approach, the unexpected connection he'd felt. Mia listened without interruption, her hands stilling on the cans she was arranging in his meticulously organized pantry. When he finished, she sat across from him at the kitchen table, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began carefully, "there's a veterans program about 50 miles from here. They work with wild horses, rehabilitation for both the animals and the vets." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through something. "I read about it last month and thought of you, but..." she trailed off, leaving unspoken the knowledge that he'd likely dismissed the suggestion outright. Hawk wheeled himself to the window, gazing out at the desert landscape. The morning light had hardened into the harsh clarity of midday, creating sharp shadows beneath the saguaros and desert shrubs. "I'm not looking for another program, Mia. I've done the VA groups, the therapy sessions, the well-meaning attempts to fix what happened. This isn't about that." His sister's reflection in the window showed her familiar expression of contained frustration. "Nobody's trying to fix you, James, but you can't spend the rest of your life out here alone, watching the desert. Even Rex wouldn't have wanted that." The mention of his service dog's name sent a familiar pang through his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. The rest of Mia's visit followed their usual routine, checking his medical supplies, discussing his upcoming VA appointments, gentle probing about his daily activities. But underlying it all was a new current of energy, sparked by the story of the Mustang. As she prepared to leave, she paused in the doorway. "Just keep an open mind, okay? Sometimes the things we think we don't need turn out to be exactly what we're looking for." After Mia's departure, Hawk found himself restless in a way he hadn't experienced since his early days of rehabilitation. The carefully constructed rhythm of his days suddenly felt confining rather than comforting. He spent the afternoon making small adjustments to his position on the porch, scanning the horizon with the same intensity he'd once reserved for combat operations. The desert stretched before him, unchanged, yet somehow different. Every movement caught his attention. A roadrunner, darting between cacti, the wind stirring dried grass, the distant shimmer of heat waves rising from the sun-baked earth. But no copper-colored coat appeared, no proud silhouette emerged from the distant haze. As evening approached, bringing with it the softer light and cooling air that made desert life bearable, Hawk made a decision. He navigated his wheelchair down the ramp he'd installed along the side of the porch, testing the packed earth of his property. The terrain was challenging. His chair's wheels sometimes caught on rocks or sank slightly into softer patches of ground, but years of adapting to his disability had taught him how to manage such obstacles. He moved further from the house than he had in months, finding a position that offered a clear view of the surrounding desert while remaining within a manageable distance of his home. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape, transforming the familiar terrain into something almost alien. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft whir of his wheelchair's wheels and the occasional call of a distant bird. Time passed differently in the desert. Minutes stretched into hours as Hawk maintained his vigil, drawing upon the same patience that had served him so well in his former life. The sky darkened, stars beginning to emerge in the vast expanse above. Still, he waited, his sniper's training, allowing him to remain perfectly still, his senses attuned to every subtle change in his surroundings. A cool breeze carried the scent of creosote and sage, the desert's natural perfume. Hawk found his thoughts drifting to his last conversation with Dr. Martinez. She had spoken about the importance of being open to unexpected opportunities for healing, about how recovery rarely followed a straight path. At the time, he had dismissed her words as typical therapy speak, but now they resonated differently. The moon rose, casting silver light across the desert floor, creating a landscape of subtle shadows and pale illumination. Still no sign of the Mustang. Yet Hawk felt no disappointment. Something had shifted within him. The simple act of waiting, of hoping for another encounter, had awakened a part of himself he thought had died in Afghanistan. For the first time since losing Rex, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, curious about what it might bring. As he finally turned his chair back toward the house, the desert night alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures beginning their daily routines, Hawk realized that Mia had been right about one thing. Something had changed. The Mustang's brief visit had cracked open a door he'd thought permanently sealed, letting in a glimmer of possibility he wasn't quite ready to name. Dawn painted the desert sky in shades of crimson and gold as Hawk wheeled himself onto the porch, his morning coffee untouched in its holder. Sleep had been elusive, his mind replaying the Mustang encounter while tactical training kept his senses alert to every sound in the desert night. The morning carried a different energy, an anticipation he hadn't felt since his days in the service, waiting for mission deployment. Movement on the horizon caught his attention. His hand instinctively reached for the binoculars he kept nearby, muscle memory from countless hours spent in observation posts. Through the lenses, he spotted it, the copper-colored Mustang, its coat gleaming in the early morning light. The horse moved with purpose, picking its way through the desert scrub with careful steps, heading directly toward his property. Hawk's pulse quickened as he lowered the binoculars. The Mustang's approach was different this time, more deliberate, less cautious. As it drew closer, he could see fresh scratches along its flank, evidence of some recent encounter. The horse's gait showed no sign of injury, but its demeanor suggested it had faced a challenge in the hours since their last meeting. The distance between them closed steadily. 20 yards, 15, 10. The Mustang's hooves kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, its breathing audible in the morning stillness. When it reached the edge of his porch, it stopped, dark, eyes fixed on Hawk with an intensity that stirred memories of his own reflection in hospital mirrors during those first days after the explosion. "Rough night," Hawk found himself speaking softly, the words emerging unbidden. The horse's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, head tilting slightly as though considering the question. A breeze carried the scent of sage and horse, mingling with the aroma of his cooling coffee. The Mustang took another step closer, nostrils flaring as it scented the air. Its proximity revealed more details. A distinctive white marking on its chest, shaped like a jagged lightning bolt, and a small notch in its right ear. Battle scars, Hawk thought, recognizing the markers of survival that told stories of past conflicts. Time seemed to suspend as they regarded each other. The horse's presence stirred something in Hawk's chest, a feeling he'd buried beneath layers of carefully constructed isolation. Here was another warrior, marked by life yet unbroken, choosing to approach rather than retreat. A distant coyote's yip broke the spell. The Mustang's head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the sound, but it didn't bolt. Instead, it shifted its weight, moving parallel to the porch while maintaining eye contact. The movement exposed its right side, revealing more recent scratches, likely from an encounter with barbed wire or a territorial dispute with other horses. Acting on instinct honed by years of caring for military working dogs, Hawk slowly wheeled himself back into the house. The Mustang watched, its posture alert but not fearful. Inside, he retrieved the first aid kit he kept stocked with both human and animal supplies, a habit from his days with Rex. When he returned to the porch, the horse had moved closer, standing, barely 5 feet from the ramp. "Easy now," Hawk murmured, opening the kit. The familiar motions of preparing antiseptic wipes and gauze centered him, providing a focus that pushed back the surreal nature of the situation. The Mustang's nostrils flared at the medicinal smell, but it held its ground, watching with intelligent eyes. Hawk knew the risks. A wild horse, no matter how seemingly calm, could be unpredictable. His vulnerable position in the wheelchair meant he had no quick escape if the animal spooked, yet the same instincts that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours told him this moment was important. A test of trust between 2 wounded warriors. Moving with deliberate slowness, he extended his hand, letting the horse become accustomed to his scent. The Mustang's breath was warm against his palm, its whiskers tickling his skin as it investigated. Then, to Hawk's amazement, it stepped closer, presenting its injured flank. The next few minutes passed in a silence broken only by the soft sounds of morning desert life and the Mustang's steady breathing. Hawk cleaned the scratches with gentle efficiency, his combat medical training serving a different purpose than ever intended. The horse remained still, occasionally shifting its weight, but showing no sign of distress. As he worked, Hawk found himself talking softly, the way he used to with Rex during their quiet moments together. He spoke of desert mornings and starlit nights, of the silence that could heal and the memories that never faded. The Mustang listened, its ears forward, occasionally nickering softly as though in response. The sun had climbed higher by the time he finished, the desert heat beginning to build. The Mustang stepped back, shaking itself as though testing the feeling of the treated wounds. It gazed at Hawk for a long moment, then lowered its head in what seemed like acknowledgement, before turning and walking unhurriedly toward the desert. Hawk watched until the horse disappeared from view, its copper coat blending with the morning light. The first aid supplies lay scattered around him, evidence that the encounter had been real and not another vivid dream born of loneliness and memory. Inside, he found himself opening the laptop Amaya had insisted he keep just in case. His fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, searching for information about wild Mustangs in the area. The screen filled with articles about local herds, their territories, and the challenges they faced from development and drought. One article caught his attention, a piece about a troubled herd living in the territories north of his property. Recent construction projects had disrupted their traditional routes to water sources, forcing them to venture closer to human settlements. The description of their typical coloring matched his visitor, suggesting the Mustang might be part of this displaced group. The research stirred old instincts. Just as he had once studied terrain maps and enemy movements, Hawk found himself analyzing the Mustang's likely patterns, considering water sources and safe passages through the developing landscape. The tactical part of his mind, long dormant, engaged with the challenge. A notification popped up on his screen, a reminder of his upcoming video session with Dr. Martinez. For the first time in months, he felt a desire to share something during their conversation. The Mustang's visit had cracked open a door he'd thought permanently sealed, letting in not just light, but possibility. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of research and reflection. Hawk's military training had taught him to analyze every encounter, to look for patterns and meaning in seemingly random events. The Mustang's return, its willingness to accept help, suggested something more than chance. In seeking treatment for its wounds, the wild creature had somehow helped dress wounds of a different kind, ones that had resisted all previous attempts at healing. The desert morning buzzed with anticipation as Hawk positioned himself for his video session with Dr. Martinez. The VA-issued laptop hummed softly, its screen showing the familiar virtual waiting room. His thoughts kept drifting to the copper-colored Mustang and their extraordinary morning encounter, making it difficult to focus on the upcoming therapy session. Dr. Martinez's face appeared on screen, her warm smile unchanged since their first meeting 3 years ago. Her office backdrop showed the usual arrangement of degrees and certificates, along with a new painting of desert wildflowers. "Good morning, James. How are you today?" Her voice carried its usual blend of professional interest and genuine concern. For once, Hawk found himself wanting to speak. The words came slowly at first, then gained momentum as he described the Mustang's visits. Dr. Martinez listened intently, her expression thoughtful as he detailed the morning's interaction. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment, studying him through the screen. "What strikes me most," she said carefully, "isn't just the extraordinary nature of these encounters, but how they've affected you, James. This is the most engaged I've seen you since we began our sessions." She leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, what do you think drew this particular horse to you?" The question caught him off guard. Hawk gazed past the laptop screen to the desert beyond his window. Maybe it recognized something familiar, he said. Finally, we both carry scars, both know what it means to navigate a world that's changed around us. Their conversation shifted into territory Hawk had previously avoided. Discussions about connection, about the possibility of finding new purpose. Dr. Martinez noted how he'd drawn upon his military medical training to help the Mustang, how his tactical skills had immediately engaged in researching the local herds. Sometimes, she observed, healing comes through unexpected channels. Your military experience, which you've often viewed as separating you from civilian life, became a bridge today, a way to help another living being. She paused, letting the words sink in. Would you be open to exploring this connection further? Before Hawk could respond, his attention snapped to movement outside his window. The Mustang had returned, standing at the edge of his property. Dr. Martinez, noting his distraction, followed his gaze through the camera. Is that your visitor? She asked softly. Yes, Hawk replied, his focus split between the screen and the horse. He's been coming closer each time. The Mustang pawed at the ground, its head held high as it surveyed the area. Dr. Martinez's voice took on an excited tone. James, this is remarkable. Wild Mustangs rarely seek out human contact like this. Have you considered documenting these interactions? It could be valuable from both a therapeutic and scientific perspective. The suggestion resonated with Hawk's military training, the importance of maintaining detailed records, of tracking patterns and progress. He found himself nodding. I could set up an observation log, like we used for monitoring target areas. Exactly, Dr. Martinez encouraged. But instead of tracking enemy movements, you'd be recording the development of trust between two unlikely allies. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And James, consider sharing this journey with others. Your sister mentioned a local veterans program working with wild horses. Your experience could be invaluable to them. The session ended with Hawk feeling more energized than he had in months. The Mustang remained outside, grazing peacefully within view of his window. After closing the laptop, he wheeled himself onto the porch, maintaining the distance that had become comfortable between them. He began speaking softly, sharing thoughts that had emerged during his therapy session. The horse's ears flicked toward his voice, though it continued grazing. Guess we both know something about adjusting to changed circumstances, Hawk mused. The Mustang raised its head, regarding him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see past his wheelchair to something deeper. As the morning progressed, Hawk found himself establishing a new routine. He retrieved a notebook, one he'd bought but never used during his initial rehabilitation, and began recording observations. The Mustang's behaviors, its patterns of movement, the subtle changes in their interactions. His military precision surfaced in the detailed notes. The horse's presence throughout the morning revealed new aspects of its personality. It was cautious, but not fearful, maintaining awareness of its surroundings while showing increasing comfort near the house. When a delivery truck approached around noon, the Mustang retreated to a safe distance, but didn't flee entirely, returning once the vehicle had departed. Maya's arrival for her midweek check-in coincided with one of these closer approaches. She pulled into the driveway slowly, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Her brother on the porch, the wild Mustang grazing barely 30 yards away. The horse raised its head at her approach, but showed no sign of panic. I thought you might have been exaggerating, Mia said softly, carefully closing her car door. But this is incredible. She moved to stand beside Hawk's wheelchair, watching the Mustang with wonder. Have you named it? The question caught him off guard. Naming the horse seemed presumptuous, as though claiming ownership over something, fundamentally free. Yet as he watched the sunlight play across its copper coat, a name surfaced from his memories. Phoenix, he said finally. Rising from ashes, finding new life in the desert. Mia's hand squeezed his shoulder gently. "It fits," she replied, understanding the layers of meaning in his choice. The Mustang, Phoenix, chose that moment to lift its head, meeting their gaze with that steady, knowing look that had first captured Hawk's attention. As Mia updated him on family news and local happenings, Hawk found himself more engaged than usual, sharing his observations about Phoenix and the research he'd been doing on local Mustang herds. His sister listened with barely concealed joy, recognizing the spark of passion that had been missing from his voice for so long. "You know," she said carefully, "that veterans program I mentioned? They're always looking for people who understand both military precision and horse behavior. Your experience with Phoenix could be valuable to them." Hawk watched as Phoenix moved gracefully across his property, its wounded flank showing signs of healing. The suggestion didn't trigger his usual defensive response. Instead, he found himself considering the possibility that his connection with this wild creature might serve a purpose beyond his own healing. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as Mia prepared to leave. Phoenix had maintained a constant presence throughout her visit, a behavior Hawk noted in his observation log. As her car disappeared down the driveway, the Mustang moved closer to the porch, as though recognizing that their private connection had been restored. Not everyone in the small desert community viewed Phoenix's presence with the same sense of wonder that Hawk and Mia shared. The first signs of trouble arrived with Tom Reeves, a local rancher whose cattle operations sprawled across the territories north of Hawk's property. His dusty pickup truck appeared one late afternoon, just as Hawk was documenting another of Phoenix's visits in his observation log. The Mustang sensed the approaching vehicle before it came into view, its ears pricking forward and muscles tensing. Beneath the copper coat, Tom's truck ground to a halt in a cloud of desert dust, and Phoenix retreated to what Hawk had noted as its safety distance, close enough to observe, but far enough to escape if needed. "Harrison," Tom called out as he approached the porch, his weathered face set in lines of concern. "Been hearing stories about a wild stallion hanging around your place." His eyes tracked Phoenix's position on the horizon. "That the one?" Hawk closed his notebook deliberately, years of military training helping him read the tension in the rancher's posture. "That's him. Been calling him Phoenix." He kept his voice neutral, waiting for Tom to reveal his purpose. "Look," Tom removed, his hat running calloused fingers through graying hair. "I respect what you've been through, and God knows you've earned the right to live as you please out here. But that Mustang's causing problems." He gestured toward the northern plains. "My cattle have been spooked 3 times this week. Found 2 calves separated from the herd yesterday. The accusation hung in the air between them." Hawk's mind automatically began analyzing the situation, mapping known locations and timelines. "Phoenix hasn't left my sight during daylight hours for the past week. If cattle are being spooked, it's not by him." Tom's expression hardened slightly. "All due respect, but you can't watch him 24/7. Wild horses don't belong this close to civilized areas. They're unpredictable, dangerous. Bureau of Land Management's been talking about another roundup in these parts. Might be for the best." The mention of roundups sent a chill through Hawk's spine. He'd researched enough about wild horse management to know what that meant. Helicopters, herding terrified animals into holding pens, families separated, proud creatures confined to government corrals or sold to questionable buyers. "Phoenix isn't threatening your cattle, Tom." Hawk's voice took on the quiet authority he'd used in combat situations. "He's wounded, displaced by the construction north of here. Once he's healed, he'll likely move on." The rancher shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with challenging a disabled veteran but determined to make his point. "It's not just about my cattle. Word gets around. Other ranchers are talking. That Mustang's getting too comfortable around humans. Sooner or later, he'll either hurt someone or get hurt himself." As if understanding the gravity of the conversation, Phoenix chose that moment to appear at his usual spot near the porch. His presence seemed deliberate, challenging. Tom's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle mounted in his truck's back. "Window, he's under my protection," Hawk stated firmly, the words emerging before he'd fully processed their implications. "If there are problems with other horses disturbing your cattle, I'll help you track them." "But Phoenix stays." Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Your property, your choice. But Harrison, keep an eye on your back. Not everyone's going to be as understanding about a wild horse taking up residence near their lands." After Tom's departure, Hawk remained on the porch, watching Phoenix graze in the fading light. The Mustang's presence had already begun to change him, drawing him out of his self-imposed isolation. Now it seemed their connection would force him to engage with the wider community, whether he was ready or not. Mia's words about the veterans program echoed in his mind. Perhaps it was time to reach out, to build alliances that could help protect Phoenix. His military training had taught him the value of having support networks in hostile territory. That evening, as shadows lengthened, across the desert floor, Hawk began composing an email to the program Maya had mentioned. His fingers moved across the laptop keyboard, describing his experiences with Phoenix, his military background, and his growing concern about the local attitude toward wild horses. Phoenix remained within sight, illuminated by the setting sun. The Mustang's coat glowed like burnished copper, his proud stance a reminder of everything wild and free that Hawk had fought to protect during his service. The horse's decision to trust him, to accept his help while maintaining its essential wildness, had awakened something Hawk thought he'd lost in Afghanistan, a sense of purpose. A response to his email arrived faster than expected. Linda Martinez, the program director, expressed immediate interest in his situation. Her message revealed that she was not only familiar with the local Mustang herds, but had been documenting the impact of recent development on their traditional territories. "Your property," she wrote, "sits at a crucial junction between the Mustangs' historical grazing lands and their remaining water sources. The fact that this stallion has chosen to trust you could be significant for our understanding of how these animals adapt to habitat changes." The email ended with an invitation to visit the program's facility to see firsthand how they worked with both veterans and wild horses. Hawk found himself considering the possibility, something that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. As night settled over the desert, Hawk wheeled himself to his usual observation point. Phoenix had moved closer, his outline visible in the gathering darkness. The Mustang's presence felt like an anchor, keeping him connected to the present moment. Rather than lost in memories of the past, a coyote's howl echoed across the plains, followed by the answering calls of its pack. Phoenix's ears swiveled toward the sound, but he showed no sign of distress. Instead, the Mustang moved closer to the house, as though recognizing it as a safe haven in an increasingly challenging world. Hawk watched as stars began to appear in the desert sky, each one a pinpoint of light in the vast darkness. He thought about the battles ahead, not the kind he'd fought in distant lands, but equally important ones. Protecting Phoenix meant stepping back into the world, becoming an advocate for something beyond his own survival. The cool night air carried the scent of creosote and sage, mingled with the distinct aroma of horse that had become surprisingly comforting. Tomorrow, he decided, he would call Linda Martinez. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward becoming part of something larger than his solitary existence. Phoenix nickered softly in the darkness, as if approving the decision. The sound carried with it a promise of challenges ahead, but also the possibility of healing, not just for a wounded warrior and a wild horse, but perhaps for others who needed to find their way back from the edges of existence. Dawn broke over the desert with an unusual energy as Hawk prepared for his visit. To the Veterans Wild Horse program, Linda Martinez had arranged for transportation, understanding his reluctance to leave Phoenix alone for too long. The Mustang seemed to sense the significance of the morning, standing closer to the porch than usual as Hawk made his final preparations. The sound of approaching tires drew both their attention. A modified van with the program's logo, a silhouette of a horse against a military medal, pulled into the driveway. Linda Martinez stepped out, her movements suggesting years of experience with both horses and veterans. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her weathered face broke into a warm smile as she approached. "Sergeant Harrison," she greeted him, her eyes taking in both him and Phoenix with professional interest. "Thank you for agreeing to visit us." Her gaze lingered on the Mustang, who had maintained his position despite the vehicle's arrival. "He's magnificent. The coloring suggests he's from the northern herd, but that level of trust with humans is extraordinary." The process of loading Hawk's wheelchair into the van was handled with practiced efficiency. Linda's movements were precise and respectful, reminding him of field medics he'd worked with, people who understood that helping didn't mean diminishing someone's dignity. Phoenix watched the entire procedure, his ears forward with interest. Just before they departed, the Mustang did something unexpected. He walked to the edge of the driveway, as though seeing them off. Linda's sharp intake of breath told Hawk this behavior was as unusual as he'd suspected. The drive to the program facility took them deeper into the desert, away from the encroaching development that had disrupted the Mustang's traditional territories. Linda filled the time with information about their work, her voice carrying the passion of someone who had found their true calling. "We started this program 5 years ago," she explained, navigating the van along poorly marked desert roads. "The idea was to help both veterans and wild horses, two groups that often struggle to find their place in the modern world. What we discovered was that they help heal each other." The facility appeared suddenly, a collection of low buildings that blended naturally into the desert landscape. As they pulled up to the main entrance, Hawk noticed the careful design of the space. Everything was accessible, with smooth paths between buildings and modified mounting areas near the corrals. "Most of our staff are veterans," Linda continued as she helped him transfer to his chair. "They understand both military precision and the patience needed to work with wild horses. We've found that the skills that keep soldiers alive in combat, awareness, focus, careful observation, are exactly what's needed to build trust with these animals." The main corral held several Mustangs, their coats dusty from rolling in the desert soil. Each horse bore the distinctive marks of wildlife: scars, proud bearing, alert eyes that missed nothing. Along the fence, a veteran in a prosthetic leg worked quietly with a dun-colored mare, his movements slow and deliberate. "That's Mike," Linda said softly. "Former Army Ranger. Lost his leg in Iraq. When he first came here, he couldn't stand being in open spaces. Too many memories of ambushes. Now he's one of our best trainers." The mare lifted her head, nickering softly at Mike, demonstrating a level of trust that spoke of long hours of patient work. They moved through the facility, Linda pointing out various areas: the rehabilitation, paddocks for injured Mustangs, the specially designed training areas, the comfortable gathering spaces where veterans could process their experiences. Everything had been created with both horses and humans in mind, respecting the needs and challenges of both. "When you wrote about Phoenix," Linda said, pausing near a water trough, "it reminded me of our first success story. We had a Marine, burned badly in an IED explosion, who couldn't connect with anyone. Then this old Mustang, scarred from a mountain lion attack, started hanging around the property. Something about their shared experience of survival created a bond that transformed them both." The story struck close to home. Hawk found himself sharing more about his interactions with Phoenix, The morning medical treatments, the growing trust, the way the Mustang seemed to understand his limitations while never treating him as less than whole. That's exactly what we've observed here, Linda nodded. These horses don't see disability the way humans do. They respond to energy, intention, patience. In many ways, they're perfect mirrors for the healing process. They approached a quieter area of the facility, where a small group of veterans sat in a loose circle, some in wheelchairs, others with various visible injuries. They were listening to an older man speak while a black Mustang grazed peacefully nearby. Our therapy sessions aren't just about horses, Linda explained. They're about finding purpose again, about using what you've learned, both in service and through suffering, to help others. Some of our participants go on to work with the horses directly. Others become advocates for wild horse preservation, and some simply find peace in being here. The afternoon brought more revelations. Hawk watched a demonstration of their training methods, noting how they incorporated military concepts of clear communication and consistent expectations while respecting the horse's wild nature. He saw veterans working through their trauma by helping injured Mustangs recover, each small victory shared between horse and human. We're not trying to domesticate these horses, Linda emphasized, as they watched a newly arrived Mustang in the rehabilitation paddock. Our goal is to protect them, to help them adapt to a changing world while maintaining their essential wildness. Sometimes that means teaching them to trust humans enough to receive help when needed. The parallels to his own situation with Phoenix were impossible to ignore. His initial reluctance to accept help, the slow building of trust, the gradual recognition that independence didn't mean isolation, all were reflected in the stories Linda shared about their work. As they prepared to return to his property, Linda made an unexpected proposal. "We'd like to set up a satellite program on your land," she said. "Your location is perfect. It's a natural corridor for the herds, and Phoenix has already shown it can be a safe space for wounded horses to heal." The suggestion caught him off guard, but something about it felt right. His property could become more than just his personal refuge. It could be part of something larger, something that helped both wild horses and wounded warriors find their way back to life. The drive home was filled with quiet contemplation. Linda shared more about the logistics of establishing a satellite program, but Hawk's thoughts were already racing ahead, his tactical mind analyzing the possibilities and challenges. As they approached his property, a familiar copper shape appeared on the horizon, Phoenix, waiting at his usual spot. The following days brought a flurry of activity to Hawk's usually quiet property. Linda's team arrived with plans and proposals, their vehicles kicking up dust clouds visible from miles away. Phoenix observed the proceedings from his self-designated safe distance, his presence a constant reminder of why these changes mattered. The satellite program would start small, a few rehabilitation paddocks, a modified round pen, and basic facilities for visiting veterans. Linda's team included a former military engineer who specialized in accessible design, ensuring every addition would accommodate wheelchairs and various mobility challenges. "We'll need to be strategic about placement," Linda explained, spreading maps across Hawk's kitchen table. "The structures should provide shelter without disrupting the natural movement patterns of the wild herds." Her finger traced the familiar paths where he'd often observed Phoenix and other Mustangs traveling between water sources. The construction plans stirred mixed emotions in Hawk. Part of him resisted the idea of change, of opening his sanctuary to others. Yet watching Phoenix's careful observation of the activity, he recognized that isolation had become its own form of prison. The Mustang had shown him that healing sometimes required accepting new possibilities. Mia arrived unannounced. One morning, her face lighting up at the sight of construction markers dotting the property. "I knew something was different when you stopped answering my calls," she said, helping him navigate around a stack of building materials. "You're actually doing this." Her presence triggered an unexpected wave of gratitude. She had never given up on him, even during his darkest periods after losing Rex. Now, as Phoenix grazed peacefully nearby and Linda's team measured distances for the first paddock, Hawk realized how far he'd come from those days of desperate solitude. The peace was shattered mid-morning by the sound of approaching vehicles. Tom Reeves's truck led a small convoy of local ranchers, dust billowing behind them as they pulled up to the construction site. Phoenix immediately retreated to higher ground, but maintained his vigilant watch over the property. "What's all this about, Harrison?" Tom demanded, gesturing at the construction markers and equipment. Several other ranchers stood behind him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Linda stepped forward, her presence calm but authoritative. "This is a satellite facility for the Veterans Wild Horse Program. We're creating a space where injured Mustangs can recover and veterans can heal." Her voice carried the weight of experience and purpose. One of the younger ranchers scoffed. "So you're turning this place into a sanctuary for those nuisance animals? They're already causing enough trouble with our herds." His hand rested meaningfully on the rifle in his truck's gun rack. Hawk wheeled himself forward, his military bearing evident despite his seated position. "These horses aren't the enemy," he stated, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once commanded troops in combat. "They're being pushed out of their territories by development, just like your cattle are feeling the pressure of changing landscapes." Tom removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "It's not that simple, Harrison. We've got livelihoods to protect. Wild horses competing for grazing land, spooking our cattle. It's not sustainable." Linda seized the moment to bridge the gap. "That's exactly why this facility matters. By providing a controlled space for injured Mustangs to recover, we can help prevent desperate horses from interfering with your operations. Plus, our research here could help develop better strategies for coexistence between wild and domestic herds." The tension in the air shifted slightly as the ranchers processed this perspective. Phoenix chose that moment to make his presence known, appearing on a nearby ridge like a copper statue against the sky. His proud bearing and obvious trust in Hawk's presence made a powerful statement about the potential for understanding between wild and human worlds. "Your cattle operation's been in your family for generations, Tom," Hawk said, watching Phoenix's careful movements. "These Mustangs' ancestors have been here even longer. Maybe instead of fighting over territory, we could find ways to protect both legacies." A thoughtful silence fell over the group. One of the older ranchers stepped forward, his weathered face creased with decades of desert sun. "My grandfather used to tell stories about working with wild horses, how they were part of the land's spirit. Maybe we've forgotten something important in our rush to claim everything for ourselves." The confrontation gradually transformed into a discussion. Linda shared stories from the main facility, where their work had actually helped reduce conflicts between wild horses and local ranchers. Some of the younger ranchers showed interest in learning more about horse behavior, recognizing that understanding these wild creatures might be better than fighting them. As the ranchers departed, Tom lingered behind. He watched Phoenix, who had maintained his position overlooking the property throughout the entire encounter. "That's one remarkable horse," he admitted finally. Maybe we've been too quick to judge these animals. Keep me informed about your progress here, Harrison. Might be something worth understanding better." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Construction crews marked foundation, points for the first paddock, while Linda's team developed plans for water management that would serve both the facility and local wildlife. Phoenix moved closer as the vehicles departed, his presence a constant reminder of why this effort mattered. That evening, as the desert cooled and construction equipment cast long shadows across the sand, Hawk found himself reflecting on the day's events. The military had taught him that the hardest battles often weren't against obvious enemies, but against misunderstanding and fear. Today had been a different kind of victory, not one through force, but through the power of connection and shared purpose. Maya stayed to help him review the facility plans, her medical background offering valuable insights into the therapeutic aspects of the design. As they worked, Phoenix maintained his vigil from the gathering dusk, his silhouette a bridge between the wild world and human endeavors. "You know," Mia said softly, watching the Mustang's quiet presence, "when I first suggested that veterans program, I never imagined it would lead to this. You're building something important here, James. Something that could help a lot of people and horses find their way back to life." The truth of her words settled over him like the desert night. What had begun as an unexpected encounter between a wounded warrior and a wild horse was growing into something larger, a place where healing could happen on multiple levels, where the boundaries between wild and tame, broken and whole, might blur into something new and powerful. The construction of the satellite facility progressed steadily over the following weeks, each day bringing new changes to the desert landscape. Phoenix adjusted to the controlled chaos with remarkable adaptability, maintaining his daily visits while observing the transformation of his chosen territory. The copper-colored Mustang seemed to understand that these changes somehow centered around him, his presence a constant reminder of the project's purpose. Linda's team had begun documenting Phoenix's behavior, particularly his interactions with the construction process. "His tolerance for human activity is extraordinary," she noted one morning, watching as the stallion calmly grazed near workers installing fence posts. Most wild horses would have abandoned an area with this much disruption. The first major milestone came with the completion of the rehabilitation paddock. Its design incorporated natural features of the landscape, existing rocks and vegetation, creating an environment that felt less like captivity and more like a protected segment of the desert itself. The day they finished the fencing, Phoenix spent hours investigating the structure, his curiosity evident in every careful step. Word of the project spread through the veteran community. One morning, a truck pulled up carrying Marcus Reynolds, a former army medic who'd lost both legs in Syria. He wheeled himself out with practiced ease, his eyes immediately finding Phoenix on the horizon. "Heard about what you're building here," Marcus said, extending his hand to Hawk. "Thought I might come see for myself." His medical background showed in the way he assessed both the facility's progress and Phoenix's behavior. "Haven't been able to work since getting hit. Never thought horses might be the answer." Hawk recognized the look in Marcus's eyes, the same searching gaze he'd seen in his own reflection countless times. "Neither did I," he admitted, watching Phoenix drift closer to inspect the newcomer. "Sometimes the best medicine comes from unexpected sources." The Mustang's approach to Marcus demonstrated a new dimension of his intelligence. Phoenix seemed to recognize another wounded warrior, his usual caution tempered with the same gentle curiosity he'd first shown Hawk. The former medic sat perfectly still in his wheelchair, tears gathering in his eyes as the wild horse drew near enough for him to feel its breath. "They don't see the chair," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They just see us." The moment crystallized everything the facility was meant to be, a place where barriers between broken and whole ceased to matter. Maya's visits now included regular updates from the VA hospital where she worked. Word of the program had spread through the veterans community, generating interest from both potential participants and healthcare providers. "They're talking about incorporating equine therapy into standard PTSD treatment," she reported. "Your work with Phoenix is changing how people think about rehabilitation." The Mustang's influence extended beyond the veteran community. Local ranchers, initially skeptical, began stopping by to observe his interactions with the facility's development. Tom Reeves became an unexpected ally, sharing his knowledge of local horse movements and helping identify areas where the wild herd's paths intersected with cattle grazing grounds. "Been thinking about what you said," Tom admitted one evening, watching Phoenix graze peacefully near the new paddock. "About protecting legacies. My grandfather used to talk about how the wild horses helped him find stray cattle. Maybe we've lost something by seeing them as enemies." Linda's team documented everything: Phoenix's behaviors, the facility's impact on local herd movements, the interactions between wild horses and visiting veterans. The data would help support similar programs elsewhere, creating a model for cooperation between ranchers, veterans, and wild horse advocates. The most significant change came in Hawk himself, the tactical precision he'd once applied to combat. Missions now focused on understanding horse behavior and veteran needs. His observation log expanded to include notes on how different veterans responded to Phoenix's presence, the ways the Mustang seemed to adapt his approach based on each person's disabilities or emotional state. One particularly memorable morning brought a visit from a young Marine, recently returned from Afghanistan with severe burns and PTSD. The veteran, barely out of his 20s, hadn't spoken since his injury. Phoenix's response was remarkable. The Mustang approached slowly, then simply stood beside the silent warrior's wheelchair, offering silent companionship that spoke louder than words. After an hour of this quiet communion, the young Marine whispered something so soft only Phoenix could hear it. The Mustang's ear flicked in response, and for the first time in months, the veteran's face showed a glimmer of peace. These moments accumulated, each one reinforcing the importance of what they were building. The facility wasn't just about rehabilitating injured horses or providing therapy for veterans. It was about creating a space where healing could happen organically, guided by the wisdom of creatures who saw beyond human limitations. Phoenix's role evolved as well. While maintaining his essential wildness, he seemed to embrace his position as ambassador between the worlds of wild and tame. Other Mustangs began appearing at the property's edges, drawn perhaps by his presence and the availability of safe water sources the facility had installed. Linda's expertise helped them understand these developments in a broader context. "Wild horses are incredibly social animals," she explained, observing a small group of Mustangs that had begun regularly visiting the property's boundaries. Phoenix isn't just adapting to human presence, he's showing his herd that coexistence is possible. The rehabilitation paddock received its first official resident, a young mare with a leg injury similar to Phoenix's original wound. The Mustang's behavior toward the newcomer revealed another layer of his character. He spent hours near the paddock, his presence seemingly offering reassurance to the injured horse. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures to the desert, the facility's impact became increasingly clear. Veterans who had participated in the program showed marked improvement in their physical and emotional well-being. The local wild horse population had established more stable patterns, reducing conflicts with ranchers. Phoenix, still free to come and go as he pleased, had become a living bridge between all these different worlds. One evening, as the setting sun painted the desert in shades of gold and purple, Hawk sat on his porch watching Phoenix interact with a group of visiting veterans. The Mustang moved among them with gentle confidence, somehow knowing which ones needed quiet presence and which were ready for more direct interaction. Maya, observing from nearby, voiced what many had come to understand. This isn't just about horses and veterans anymore. It's about finding new ways to heal old wounds, not just for individuals, but for entire communities. The desert wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats, more wild horses moving through their ancestral lands, perhaps drawn by Phoenix's example. The copper-colored stallion lifted his head at the sound, but made no move to leave. He had found his purpose here, just as Hawk had found his. Winter descended on the desert with unexpected ferocity, bringing storms that painted the distant mountains white and tested the facility's preparedness. Phoenix's behavior changed with the weather. He began spending more time near the buildings, his protective instincts extending to the other horses that had sought shelter in the area. The rehabilitation paddock now housed 3 recovering Mustangs, each with its own story of survival. The young mare had healed well under their care, but 2 new arrivals, victims of the harsh winter conditions, required constant attention. Phoenix seemed to appoint himself as their guardian, maintaining a vigilant presence even during the worst of the storms. Linda's team had documented an extraordinary development. Other wild herds were using the facility's land as a winter gathering point, drawn by both the reliable water sources and Phoenix's established presence. "This is unprecedented," she explained during one of their daily briefings. "They're creating new migration patterns around this safe haven." The veteran program continued despite the weather, though now many sessions moved indoors to the newly completed community center. The building, designed with both wheelchairs and horses in mind, featured large windows that kept Phoenix visible to participants even when conditions kept them inside. His constant presence had become an essential part of the healing process. Marcus Reynolds, who had become a regular visitor, took on the role of medical coordinator for the program. His experience as a combat medic proved invaluable in treating injured horses while helping other veterans connect with their own healing journey. "Every wound tells a story," he would say, working alongside Hawk to treat their equine patients. "The trick is learning to read them right." The winter storms brought unexpected challenges. One particularly severe night, the wind howling across the desert like artillery fire, they received an emergency call from Tom Reeves. Several of his cattle had been spooked by the storm, breaking through fencing and heading into dangerous territory. Without hesitation, Hawk organized a search party, coordinating with local ranchers and program participants. What happened next would become legend in the local community. Phoenix, who had been sheltering near the facility, suddenly appeared alongside the search teams. The Mustang seemed to understand their mission, moving with purpose through the storm-ravaged landscape. His knowledge of the territory proved invaluable, as he led them to a ravine where the missing cattle had sought shelter. Tom's face showed both gratitude and amazement as they worked together to guide the cattle home. Veterans, ranchers, and a wild horse moving as one unit through the challenging conditions. "Never thought I'd see the day," he admitted later, watching Phoenix return to his self-appointed post near the rehabilitation paddock. "A wild Mustang helping round up cattle. My grandfather would have loved this." The incident marked a turning point in local attitudes toward the program. Ranchers who had once viewed wild horses as nuisances began to see possibilities for cooperation. Several approached Linda about implementing similar programs on their properties, recognizing the value of working with the Mustangs rather than against them. Maya brought news from the VA hospital that further validated their work. The success stories from their program had caught the attention of military medical commanders. Plans were being discussed to establish similar facilities near major veterans' hospitals, using their model of combining horse rehabilitation with veteran recovery. The winter weeks brought a steady stream of new participants. Each arrival seemed to strengthen Phoenix's remarkable ability to assess and respond to different needs. He showed infinite patience with those bearing physical wounds, standing rock steady beside wheelchairs and prosthetic limbs. For those carrying invisible scars, he offered silent companionship that spoke louder than words. One particularly powerful moment came when a group of veterans' families visited the facility. Children who had grown up with changed parents watched in wonder as their mothers and fathers found new ways to connect through their interactions with Phoenix and the other horses. The Mustang's gentle acceptance of their presence helped bridge gaps that trauma had created. Hawk observed these transformations from his unique perspective, maintaining his detailed logs while adding new insights about the healing process. His military training helped him recognize patterns in how different veterans responded to the program, information that proved valuable in tailoring approaches to individual needs. The community center became a hub of activity during the stormy days. Veterans gathered to share stories, not just of combat experiences, but of their journeys with the horses. Phoenix would often stand at the large windows, his presence a reminder of the wild spirit that had brought them all together. Linda's research team documented everything, building a comprehensive study of how their program affected both human and equine participants. The data showed remarkable improvements in PTSD symptoms among veterans who worked with the horses, while the Mustangs demonstrated increased tolerance for human interaction without losing their essential wild nature. As winter's grip began to ease, bringing hints of spring to the desert landscape, Hawk reflected on the changes the past months had brought. The facility had grown beyond his initial vision, becoming something that belonged not just to him or even to Phoenix, but to the entire community of wounded warriors and wild spirits that had found healing there. One clear evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Hawk wheeled himself to his original observation point, the spot where he had first encountered Phoenix. The copper-colored stallion joined him, their familiar companionable silence speaking volumes about their shared journey. The desert wind carried the sounds of life from the facility, voices of veterans working with horses, the gentle nicker of Mustangs in the rehabilitation paddock, the distant lowing of cattle on Tom's ranch. Each sound represented a connection forged, a barrier broken, a wound beginning to heal. Phoenix's ears swiveled toward approaching hoofbeats, more wild horses. Arriving as dusk settled over the land, the Mustang remained beside Hawk's wheelchair, watching as his wild brethren found their places in this new landscape where freedom and healing had found common ground. The story of a wounded warrior and a wild horse had transformed into something larger, a testament to the power of unexpected connections and the endless possibilities for healing when barriers between worlds begin to fall. Their journey had only begun, but already its ripples were spreading far beyond the desert horizons, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways neither could have imagined during that first extraordinary encounter. Spring brought dramatic changes to the desert landscape, painting the usually barren terrain with explosions of wildflowers. The winter rains had blessed the region with a rare superbloom, transforming the facility's grounds into a canvas of purple, yellow, and orange blossoms. Phoenix moved through these natural gardens like a copper ghost, his coat gleaming against the riot of colors. The facility's success had drawn attention from unexpected quarters. A documentary filmmaker arrived one morning, her cameras and equipment causing initial concern among both horses and veterans. Yet Phoenix's calm acceptance of the intrusion seemed to set the tone for everyone else. The Mustang had developed an uncanny ability to gauge situations, his reactions often guiding others through unfamiliar territory. Chelsea Martinez, no relation to Linda, had built her career documenting stories of healing and transformation. "There's something unique happening here," she observed, watching Phoenix interact with a group of newly arrived veterans. "It's not just about rehabilitation, it's about rediscovering purpose." The filming process revealed layers of the program's impact that even its participants hadn't fully recognized. Through Chelsea's lens, they watched Phoenix's subtle communications with different veterans, how he adjusted his approach based on their emotional states, how his presence could calm anxiety attacks before they fully manifested, how he seemed to understand when someone needed space or connection. One particularly powerful sequence captured the arrival of a female veteran, Amanda Torres, who had lost her right arm and suffered severe burns in a helicopter crash. Amanda's initial reaction to the facility had been skepticism bordering on hostility. "I didn't serve my country to end up talking to horses," she had declared, her voice carrying the edge of unresolved trauma. Phoenix's response to Amanda became a masterclass in patience and intuition. The Mustang kept his distance at first, grazing, within sight, but never approaching. Each day he would position himself slightly closer, his movements casual yet purposeful. Amanda pretended not to notice, but the cameras caught her watching him when she thought no one was looking. The breakthrough came during a spring thunderstorm. Amanda had been caught between the rehabilitation paddock and the community center when the first lightning struck. Her PTSD triggered instantly, the thunder too similar to the sounds that had preceded her helicopter's crash. Before anyone could reach her, Phoenix was there, positioning himself between her and the storm, his solid presence offering shelter from both rain and memories. Chelsea's cameras captured the moment Amanda's defenses crumbled, her one hand buried. In Phoenix's mane, she wept for the first time since her injury. The Mustang stood perfectly still, a living anchor in the storm of her emotions. From that day forward, Amanda became one of the program's most dedicated participants, her own healing journey, inspiring other veterans to open themselves to new possibilities. The documentary project expanded to include the wider impact of the facility on the local community. Tom Reeves, once skeptical of wild horses, had become an advocate for cooperative land management. His ranch now hosted workshops where veterans and ranchers worked together to develop strategies for protecting both cattle and Mustang territories. Mia's role had evolved as well. Her medical expertise, combined with her understanding of both veteran and horse psychology, made her invaluable in developing new therapeutic approaches. The VA hospital where she worked had started referring patients directly to the program, recognizing the unique benefits of their integrated healing model. Linda's research team documented an unexpected phenomenon: the wild herds that frequented the facility's lands showed measurably different behavior patterns than other Mustang groups. These horses maintained their wild nature, but demonstrated increased tolerance for human activity and a sophisticated understanding of boundaries. Phoenix remained the heart of it all, his influence extending far beyond the facility's borders. Other rehabilitation centers began reporting similar experiences, with individual Mustangs stepping into leadership roles, as though the concept of bridge building between wild and human worlds was spreading through the horse community itself. Marcus Reynolds, working with Linda's team, developed a training program for other veterans interested in horse rehabilitation work. "It's about understanding that healing goes both ways," he explained to a group of new participants. "These horses teach us as much as we help them." The spring months brought a steady stream of visitors: military medical personnel, wildlife researchers, representatives from other veteran organizations. Each arrival seemed to validate the importance of what had started as a chance encounter between a wounded warrior and a wild horse. Chelsea's cameras captured the daily rhythms of the facility. Early morning therapy sessions as the desert came. Alive, afternoon workshops where veterans learned about horse behavior and habitat preservation. Evening gatherings where stories and experiences were shared. Through it all, Phoenix moved like a constant thread, weaving connections between different groups and individuals. The documentary began to reveal a larger story about healing and adaptation in a changing world. The facility had become more than a rehabilitation center. It was a model for how different communities could come together around shared purposes. how ancient wisdom about connection with nature could blend with modern understanding of trauma and recovery. One sequence followed, a young veteran through his first month at the facility. The cameras tracked his progression from withdrawn silence to cautious interaction, culminating in a moment where he helped treat an injured Mustang under Phoenix's watchful eye. The parallel healing of human and horse, captured in silent footage, spoke volumes about the program's transformative power. Amanda Torres, now helping coordinate the female veteran program, shared her perspective with Chelsea's team. "We come here thinking we're broken," she said, watching Phoenix guide a newly arrived Mustang toward the rehabilitation paddock. "But these horses show us that scars don't define strength. Sometimes they're just maps showing how far we've come." The spring superbloom began to fade, but its impact lingered in the form of strengthened grazing opportunities for both wild horses and cattle. The cooperation between ranchers and the facility had led to better resource management, proving that different needs could be balanced when communities worked together. As Chelsea's documentary neared completion, the facility prepared for its next evolution. The success of their program had sparked interest in creating similar centers across the country. Phoenix's story was becoming a blueprint for how wounded warriors and wild horses could help heal each other. One evening, as the filming wrapped up, Hawk found himself back on his porch with Phoenix nearby. Chelsea's cameras captured this quiet moment. The wounded warrior and the wild horse who had started it all. Their silhouettes merged against the setting sun. The desert wind carried the promise of more changes to come, more lives to touch, more barriers to break down. The Mustang's presence beside his wheelchair spoke of a journey that had transformed not just two lives, but an entire community's understanding of healing, freedom, and the unbreakable bonds that could form between the most unlikely souls. Their story, soon to be shared with the world, carried a simple but powerful message. Sometimes the deepest wounds could only be healed by helping others find their way back to wholeness. The premiere of Chelsea's documentary, Wild Hearts Healing, brought an unexpected gathering to the facility. A temporary outdoor screen had been set up near the rehabilitation paddocks, allowing both human and equine participants to attend. Phoenix stood at his usual post near Hawk's wheelchair, his presence a living testament to the story about to unfold on screen. Military officials, VA administrators, wildlife experts, and local ranchers sat together on folding chairs under the desert stars. Tom Reeves and his fellow ranchers had helped organize the event, their trucks forming a protective circle around the viewing area. Amanda Torres, now the facility's outreach coordinator, guided new visitors to their seats, her confidence a far cry from her first desperate days at the center. The film opened with the moment that had started it all, a recreation of Hawk's first encounter with Phoenix, interwoven with actual footage of their daily interactions. The audience watched in silence as the story unfolded, revealing how one connection had sparked a movement that was changing lives across the country. Throughout the screening, Phoenix remained unusually alert, his ears pricked forward as though recognizing his own story. Other Mustangs gathered at the edges of the property, their silhouettes visible in the moonlight. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Wild and tame, broken and whole, all coming together under the vast desert sky. The documentary captured moments that even those involved hadn't fully appreciated at the time. The subtle ways Phoenix communicated with traumatized veterans, the gradual transformation of the facility from a private refuge to a community healing center, the breaking down of barriers between different groups who had once viewed each other with suspicion. Maya watched with tears in her eyes as the film showed her brother's journey from isolated veteran to community leader. The camera had caught moments of quiet interaction between Hawk and Phoenix that revealed the depth of their connection. Moments where words weren't necessary, where understanding flowed between species in a language of shared experience. Linda Martinez's research findings, presented throughout the documentary, provided scientific validation for what participants had experienced firsthand. The data showed significant improvements in PTSD symptoms among veterans who worked with the horses, while the Mustangs demonstrated remarkable adaptation without losing their essential wild nature. As the film concluded, a spontaneous gathering formed around the refreshment area. Veterans shared stories with ranchers. Wildlife experts discussed preservation strategies with military officials, and families connected over shared experiences of healing and hope. Phoenix moved through the crowd with his characteristic grace, accepting gentle touches from those he knew while maintaining the dignified distance that marked him as forever wild. The success of the documentary led to immediate action. The Department of Veterans Affairs announced funding for similar programs across the country. Wildlife management agencies began revising their approaches to Mustang preservation, incorporating lessons learned from the facility's cooperative model. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the local level. The facility had become a bridge between different worlds, military and civilian, wild and domestic, past and future. Regular workshops now brought together veterans, ranchers, and wildlife experts to develop sustainable approaches to land management and animal preservation. Tom Reeves, speaking to a group of visiting ranchers, summed up the transformation. "We used to see these horses as problems to solve. Now we understand they're partners in preserving our way of life. It takes a wild heart to teach us civilized folks about cooperation." The facility's influence continued to grow. Military medical units began incorporating equine therapy into standard treatment protocols. Universities sent researchers to study the unique dynamics between veterans and Mustangs. International delegations arrived to learn how the program might be adapted for their own wounded warriors. Phoenix's role evolved with the facility's expansion. While maintaining his freedom to roam, he seemed to understand his position as ambassador between worlds. New Mustangs arriving at the rehabilitation paddocks would find him waiting, his presence helping ease their transition. Veterans struggling with their first visits would often find him nearby, offering silent support. Amanda Torres developed a special program for female veterans, drawing on her own journey of healing. "These horses see past gender, past injury, past all the labels we carry," she would explain. "They respond to who we are beneath the scars." Her work attracted attention from military leaders looking to better serve women veterans. Marcus Reynolds' medical expertise proved invaluable as the program expanded. Working with Linda's team, he developed protocols for identifying which veterans might benefit most from horse interaction. His understanding of both physical and psychological trauma helped bridge the gap between traditional therapy and alternative healing approaches. The facility's success inspired changes in wild horse management across the region. Other ranchers, seeing the benefits of cooperation, began setting aside corridors for Mustang movement. The horses, in turn, seemed to respect these boundaries, as though understanding the importance of maintaining the delicate balance between wild and domestic spaces. Myers VA Hospital became a model for integrating equine therapy into mainstream medical treatment. Her presentations at medical conferences helped spread understanding of how interaction with horses could complement traditional approaches to physical and psychological healing. 1 year after the documentary's premiere, the facility hosted a celebration of its achievements. Veterans whose lives had been transformed returned to share their stories. Ranchers spoke of changed perspectives and renewed connection to the land. Families celebrated the return of loved ones they had feared lost to trauma. Throughout the gathering, Phoenix maintained his quiet vigil near Hawk's position. The years had added silver to the Mustang's muzzle, but his bearing remained proud, his connection to the wounded warrior as strong as ever. Together, they watched the future they had helped create unfold beneath the endless desert sky. The facility had become more than a place of healing. It was a testament to the power of unexpected connections, to the possibility of finding wholeness through helping others. Each sunrise brought new veterans seeking hope, new Mustangs needing shelter, new opportunities to bridge the gaps between different worlds. As the celebration wound down, Hawk found himself back on his porch, Phoenix at his side. The desert wind carried the sounds of life from the facility, voices sharing stories, horses nickering softly, the gentle rhythm of healing and progress. What had begun as two wounded souls finding common ground had grown into a movement that touched countless lives. The story of the wounded warrior and the wild Mustang had no true ending, for it lived on in every veteran who found hope in a horse's eyes, every Mustang that learned to trust without surrendering its freedom, every barrier broken down between those who had once seen each other as enemies. It was a reminder that sometimes the deepest healing comes not from fighting our battles alone, but from helping others find their way back to wholeness. In the gathering dusk, Phoenix lifted his head to scent the wind, his copper coat painted gold by the setting sun. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for healing, new chances to prove that even the wildest heart could find its purpose in helping others find their way home. If this story of a wounded warrior and a wild Mustang touched your heart, remember that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this story with others who might need a reminder that healing is possible, even in life's darkest moments.